Imagine this. You're 13 days away from the end of the world. It's 1962, and American spy planes have just spotted Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba, 90 miles from Florida. President Kennedy blockades the island. Khrushchev refuses to back down. The world holds its breath. Somehow, we survived. But that wasn't the end. It was just one chapter in a 75-year rivalry that's brought us to the brink again and again. NATO versus Russia, democracy versus authoritarianism. And today, with Ukraine burning and nuclear weapons back on the table, the stakes have never been higher. This is Full History of NATO and Russia. To understand why NATO was created, we need to rewind to 1945. World War II has just ended. The Nazi regime lies in ruins. But as the smoke clears over Europe, a new reality emerges. The alliance that won the war is already fracturing. Imagine Europe as a chessboard that's been knocked over. Cities are destroyed. Economies are shattered. Millions are dead or displaced. And into this vacuum step two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. They were allies against Hitler, but they have fundamentally different visions for the world. The United States champions democratic capitalism, free markets, free elections, individual liberty. The Soviet Union, under Stalin, promotes communist ideology, state control of the economy, single-party rule, collective ownership. These aren't just competing philosophies, they're incompatible worldviews. In March 1946, Winston Churchill delivers a speech in Fulton, Missouri. He warns that an iron curtain has descended across the continent. On one side, Western Europe, still free but economically devastated. On the other, Eastern Europe, now under Soviet domination. Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, East Germany all fall under Moscow's control. Think of it like this. Stalin sees Eastern Europe as a buffer zone, protection against another invasion like the one that cost the Soviet Union 27 million lives during World War II. But to the West, it looks like naked imperialism, communism spreading across the map like a virus. In 1947, the tensions escalate. President Harry Truman announces what becomes known as the Truman Doctrine. He declares that the United States will support free peoples resisting subjugation. Translation: America will actively oppose Soviet expansion. The Marshall Plan follows, billions of dollars in American aid to rebuild Western Europe. It's brilliant strategy, really. Stable, prosperous democracies won't turn to communism. But Stalin sees it differently. Economic warfare. The West trying to buy loyalty. Then comes 1948 and the first major crisis, the Berlin blockade. Germany, you see, has been divided into 4 occupation zones: American, British, French, and Soviet. Berlin, deep inside Soviet-controlled East Germany, is also divided. In June 1948, Stalin decides to test Western resolve. He cuts off all land access to West Berlin. No roads, no rail lines, nothing. 2 million West Berliners are trapped, running out of food and fuel. The West faces a choice: abandon Berlin or break through the blockade, risking war. President Truman chooses a third option: the Berlin airlift. For nearly a year, American and British planes fly around the clock delivering supplies. At the peak, planes land every 90 seconds. It's a logistical miracle and a propaganda victory. Stalin blinks first. In May 1949, he lifts the blockade. But the damage to East-West relations is permanent. 1 week after the blockade ends, on April 4, 1949, 12 nations signed the North Atlantic Treaty in Washington. The founding members are the United States, Canada, Britain, France, Belgium, Netherlands, Luxembourg, Norway, Denmark, Iceland, Italy, and Portugal. Article 5 is the heart of the treaty. An attack on one member is an attack on all. It's collective security, the idea that together these democracies can deter Soviet aggression. NATO's first Secretary General, Lord Ismay, supposedly describes the alliance's purpose in 3 phrases: keep the Russians out, the Americans in, and the Germans down. It's crude, but it captures the reality. NATO is designed to contain Soviet power, maintain American commitment to European security, and prevent German militarism from rising again. The Soviet response is predictable: fury. Soviet media calls NATO an aggressive bloc aimed at destroying the socialist world. And here's where we see the fundamental pattern that will define this rivalry. Each side views its own actions as defensive and the other side's as aggressive. NATO sees itself as a defensive alliance protecting freedom. The Soviets see encirclement and threat. The Soviets see their Eastern European sphere as legitimate security interests. NATO sees oppression and expansionism. Who's right? Both sides believe they are, absolutely. And that mutual certainty makes the conflict so dangerous. In 1950, the Cold War turns hot, just not in Europe. North Korea, backed by Stalin and Mao's China, invades South Korea. The Korean War demonstrates that the communist-capitalist conflict is global, not just European. NATO responds by rearming. Greece and Turkey joined the alliance in 1952, extending its reach to the Eastern Mediterranean. In 1954, the Western Allies decide that West Germany must be rearmed and integrated into NATO. It's a controversial decision. Germany started 2 world wars after all, but the Soviet threat overrides the hesitation. 8 days later, the Soviet Union announces the Warsaw Pact. The Warsaw Pact brings together the Soviet Union, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and East Germany in a military alliance. On paper, it's a counterweight to NATO. In reality, it's a tool for Moscow to control its satellites. The dividing lines are now formalized. Europe is split into 2 armed camps. The Cold War is fully operational.
By the mid-1950s, both sides have nuclear weapons. Let that sink in. 2 hostile alliances, each capable of destroying civilization, facing each other across a divided continent. It's like a permanent standoff with loaded guns pointed at each other's heads. The strategy that emerges is called mutually assured destruction, or MAD. And yes, the acronym is intentional. If either side launches a nuclear attack, the other will retaliate, ensuring both are destroyed. It's deterrence through the promise of mutual suicide. Think of it as the ultimate game of chicken, except the cars are nuclear arsenals, and there's no road to veer off on. In 1956, the first major test of the post-Stalin era arrives. In Hungary, students and workers rise up against Soviet control, demanding democracy and withdrawal of Soviet troops. For a brief moment, it seems possible that Hungary might break free from the Warsaw Pact. NATO watches closely. Some Hungarian rebels hope for Western intervention, but it doesn't come. On November 4th, 1956, Soviet tanks roll into Budapest. The uprising is crushed brutally. Thousands die. The message is clear. The Soviet Union will use overwhelming force to maintain its empire. And NATO's message is equally clear. We won't risk nuclear war over Eastern Europe. It's a brutal calculation, but it establishes the rules. Neither side will directly challenge the other's core interests. In 1961, those rules face another test, the Berlin crisis. Khrushchev, the Soviet leader, demands that the Western powers leave Berlin. When they refuse, the Soviets build a solution, a wall, literally. On August 13, 1961, construction begins on the Berlin Wall, dividing the city in two. It's supposed to stop the flood of East Germans fleeing to the west. 3 million have already escaped. But it becomes the most powerful symbol of the Cold War. Concrete and barbed wire, guards with orders to shoot anyone trying to cross, families separated for decades. President John F. Kennedy visits West Berlin in 1963 and declares, "Ich bin ein Berliner." I am a Berliner. It's a message of solidarity, but also acceptance. The wall will stand. Neither side will push too hard. But that understanding almost breaks down completely in October 1962. The Cuban Missile Crisis is the closest the world comes to nuclear war during the Cold War. The Soviet Union, led by Nikita Khrushchev, secretly places nuclear missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles from Florida. American U-2 spy planes discover the missiles on October 14, 1962. For 13 days, the world holds its breath. Kennedy blockades Cuba. Khrushchev refuses to back down initially. American nuclear forces go to DEFCON 2, one step away from nuclear war. NATO prepares for the possibility that Europe could become a nuclear battlefield within hours. Behind the scenes, frantic diplomacy unfolds. Kennedy and Khrushchev exchange letters. The two leaders are essentially negotiating directly without fully consulting their alliances. Finally, Khrushchev agrees to remove the missiles in exchange for an American promise not to invade Cuba and a secret agreement to remove American missiles from Turkey. The world steps back from the brink. The Cuban Missile Crisis teaches both sides a terrifying lesson. They've created a system where a single miscalculation could end civilization. In its aftermath, they establish a direct communication line between Washington and Moscow, the famous hotline, to prevent misunderstandings in future crises. They also begin the slow process of arms control negotiations. If they can't be friends, at least they can try not to accidentally destroy the world. Throughout the 1960s, a new dynamic emerges, détente, or the relaxation of tensions. It doesn't mean the rivalry ends, far from it, but it means accepting that neither side will defeat the other militarily and that coexistence is necessary. In 1968, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty is signed, attempting to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons. Arms control talks begin. Cultural exchanges increase. But just when it seems tensions are easing, 1968 brings another crisis. Czechoslovakia, under Alexander Dubček, attempts to create socialism with a human face. Political reforms, freedom of speech, a loosening of Soviet control. It's called the Prague Spring. The Soviet response is predictable. In August 1968, Warsaw Pact forces invade Czechoslovakia. Dubček is arrested. The reforms are crushed. The message is again unmistakable. There are limits to what Moscow will tolerate. Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev articulates what becomes known as the Brezhnev Doctrine. the Soviet Union has the right to intervene in any Warsaw Pact country if socialism is threatened. In other words, once communist, always communist, by force if necessary. Despite these crises, or perhaps because of them, the 1970s see serious arms control efforts. In 1972, President Richard Nixon visits Moscow and signs the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, or SALT I, which limits the number of strategic nuclear weapons each side can deploy. It's not disarmament. Both sides still have enough weapons to destroy each other many times over, but it's a start. It represents an acknowledgement that the arms race has become absurdly dangerous and expensive. The Helsinki Accords follow in 1975, a comprehensive agreement recognizing European borders and committing signatories to respect human rights. The Soviet Union sees it as Western acceptance of its Eastern European empire. Western countries see the human rights provisions as a tool to pressure communist governments. Both interpretations prove correct. The Helsinki process becomes a framework for ongoing East-West dialogue, even as fundamental disagreements persist.
By the late 1970s, détente is dying. Both sides feel the other has violated the spirit of cooperation. The arms race continues. Regional conflicts in Africa, Asia, and Latin America become proxy battles between the superpowers. Then, in December 1979, the Soviet Union makes a catastrophic mistake. Afghanistan is in turmoil. A communist government has taken power but faces widespread opposition. Fearing Afghanistan will slip from Soviet influence, Brezhnev orders an invasion. On December 24, 1979, Soviet troops cross the border. The West reacts with outrage. President Jimmy Carter calls it the most serious threat to peace since the Second World War. The United States boycotts the 1980 Moscow Olympics. More importantly, the CIA begins covertly supporting Afghan resistance fighters, the Mujahideen. What starts as a quick intervention becomes a decade-long quagmire. The Soviets find themselves fighting an unwinnable guerrilla war in Afghanistan's mountains. It's the Soviet Union's Vietnam, a conflict that drains resources, demoralizes the military, and undermines the regime's legitimacy. In 1980, something remarkable happens in Poland. Workers at the Gdansk shipyard, led by an electrician named Lech Walesa, go on strike and form an independent trade union called Solidarity. Within months, Solidarity has 10 million members, 1/4 of Poland's population. It's unprecedented, an independent organization in a communist country openly challenging the regime. Moscow pressures Poland's communist government to crack down. In December 1981, Polish General Wojciech Jaruzelski declares martial law. Solidarity is banned, its leaders arrested. But the genie is out of the bottle. Poles have tasted freedom, and they won't forget it. In 1980, Ronald Reagan is elected President of the United States. Reagan is different from his predecessors. He doesn't accept détente or coexistence. He believes the Soviet system is fundamentally evil and destined to fail. His goal isn't to contain communism, but to defeat it. Reagan dramatically increases military spending. He proposes the Strategic Defense Initiative, or Star Wars, a missile defense system that would theoretically make nuclear weapons obsolete. Most scientists doubt it's technically feasible, but that's not entirely the point. It's psychological warfare, forcing the Soviets to either match American spending or concede technological inferiority. The Soviet economy, already stagnating, can't keep pace. The system is cracking under the weight of military spending, economic inefficiency, and bureaucratic corruption.
In March 1985, a relatively young Soviet leader takes power, Mikhail Gorbachev. He's 54, a reformer who understands the system is broken. He introduces two policies that will inadvertently destroy the Soviet Union: glasnost, or openness, and perestroika, or restructuring. Gorbachev believes he can reform communism, make it more efficient, more responsive, more legitimate. He's wrong. Once you allow people to speak freely, they don't just criticize inefficiency, they question the entire system. Reagan and Gorbachev develop an unexpected working relationship. They meet in summits, Geneva in 1985, Reykjavik in 1986, Washington in 1987, Moscow in 1988. In 1987, they signed the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, eliminating an entire class of nuclear weapons. It's the first time the superpowers agree to reduce, not just limit, their arsenals. In 1989, the impossible happens. Not slowly, not gradually, but in a stunning cascade of events. Poland is first. In semi-free elections in June 1989, Solidarity wins overwhelmingly. By August, Poland has a non-communist prime minister for the first time in 4 decades. Hungary opens its border with Austria in September, creating a hole in the Iron Curtain. East Germans start fleeing through Hungary to the west by the thousands. In October, massive protests in East Germany force the communist government to make concessions. On November 9, 1989, an East German official confused about new travel regulations accidentally announces that the borders are open immediately. Berliners rush to the wall. Guards, overwhelmed and receiving no orders to stop them, stand aside. People begin smashing the concrete with hammers and bare hands. The Berlin Wall, the symbol of division for 28 years, falls in a single night. Then it's Czechoslovakia's turn, the Velvet Revolution, peaceful protests that topple the communist government in weeks. Bulgaria follows. Romania's revolution is violent. Dictator Nicolae Ceausescu is executed on Christmas Day, but the result is the same: the end of communist rule. The Warsaw Pact is finished. The Soviet Empire in Eastern Europe disintegrates in a matter of months. Throughout this revolutionary period, Gorbachev makes a crucial decision. He won't use force to maintain Soviet control. There will be no repeat of Hungary 1956 or Czechoslovakia 1968. He lets the Eastern European dominoes fall. Why? Partly because he's a reformer who rejects the brutality of his predecessors. Partly because the Soviet Union can't afford another crackdown, economically, politically, or morally. And partly because he still believes the Soviet Union itself can reform and survive. He's wrong about that last part. In 1990, Germany begins the process of reunification. The big question, will a united Germany be neutral or will it join NATO? Gorbachev initially opposes NATO membership, but the West, particularly the United States, insists. In the end, Gorbachev agrees, partly in exchange for economic aid, partly because he has little choice. Here's where the story gets controversial, where Russian and Western narratives diverge sharply. Some Russian officials later claimed that Western leaders, particularly U.S. Secretary of State Baker, promised Gorbachev that NATO would not expand 1 inch eastward beyond Germany. Western officials deny any such promise was made, or if discussed, it referred only to East Germany, not further eastward. There's no signed document, no treaty, no formal agreement, but the Russian perception that they were promised NATO wouldn't expand and that promise was broken becomes central to Russian grievances in the coming decades. On December 25, 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev resigns as president of the Soviet Union. The red flag with the hammer and sickle is lowered from the Kremlin for the last time. The Soviet Union officially ceases to exist. The Cold War is over. NATO has won without firing a shot. The 1990s begin with extraordinary optimism in the West. The United States is the sole superpower. Democracy and free markets have triumphed. Some thinkers proclaim the end of history, the idea that liberal democracy represents the final form of human government. NATO faces an identity crisis. The Soviet threat is gone. The Warsaw Pact has dissolved. What's the alliance's purpose now? Russia, meanwhile, is in chaos. The economy collapses. State assets are grabbed by oligarchs in a chaotic privatization. Inflation wipes out savings. Life expectancy drops. It's a humiliating, traumatic period for a country that was recently a superpower. Boris Yeltsin, Russia's first post-Soviet leader, tries to build a democratic, capitalist Russia. He cooperates with the West, hopes for integration into Western institutions. But he's presiding over disaster, and his popularity plummets. NATO, searching for a new mission, begins discussing expansion. The former Warsaw Pact countries, Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic, want to join. They see NATO membership as insurance against any Russian resurgence, as integration into the West, as proof they've truly escaped Moscow's orbit. But this is where the post-Cold War consensus breaks down. Many Western experts warn against NATO expansion. George Kennan, the diplomat who articulated the containment strategy against the Soviet Union, calls it a tragic mistake. He argues it will inflame Russian nationalism and poison relations with the West. Others argue the opposite. These countries have every right to choose their alliances. Russia doesn't get a veto over NATO membership, and these countries deserve protection, given their history of Soviet domination. In 1997, NATO formally invites Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic to join, which they do in 1999. The decision is presented as inevitable, democratic, righteous. In Russia, across the political spectrum, it's seen as betrayal, not just by hardliners, but by liberals and reformers too. Even those who supported cooperation with the West feel deceived. The narrative takes hold. The West promised not to expand NATO, then did exactly that while Russia was too weak to resist. The 1990s also bring a new challenge, the breakup of Yugoslavia and the resulting wars. It's a humanitarian catastrophe. Ethnic cleansing, massacres, concentration camps in Europe 50 years after the Holocaust. NATO struggles with how to respond. In 1995, after the Srebrenica massacre, NATO finally intervenes with bombing campaigns against Bosnian Serb forces. It works. The Dayton Accords end the Bosnian War. But it sets a precedent. NATO acting beyond its original defensive mandate, intervening in a sovereign country's internal affairs. In 1999, the Kosovo War escalates. Serbia, led by Slobodan Milosevic, is conducting ethnic cleansing against Kosovo's Albanian majority. The United Nations Security Council is paralyzed. Russia, Serbia's ally, threatens to veto any intervention. NATO decides to act anyway, without UN approval. For 78 days, NATO aircraft bomb Serbia. The campaign succeeds militarily. Milosevic eventually withdraws from Kosovo, but the implications are profound. Russia is furious. The bombing of Belgrade, to Russians, looks like Western aggression against a Slavic ally. More fundamentally, NATO has set a precedent, intervening militarily without UN approval when it deems necessary. Russian Foreign Minister Igor Ivanov warns that NATO is transforming from a defensive alliance into a threat to universal peace and security. Russian politician Alexei Arbatov predicts that NATO expansion and interventionism will lead to a resentful and hostile Russia. They're not wrong. By 1999, the stage is set for renewed conflict. NATO has expanded. NATO has demonstrated willingness to use force without UN approval. And Russia, humiliated and weakened, is nursing grievances. Then, on New Year's Eve 1999, Boris Yeltsin resigns and names his successor, a former KGB officer named Putin. Everything is about to change. Vladimir Putin takes power in Russia with one overriding goal: restore Russian strength and prestige. He's determined to end the chaos of the Yeltsin years, to make Russia a great power again, to ensure Russia is never humiliated like it was in the 1990s. At first, Putin tries cooperation with the West. After September 11, 2001, he's the first world leader to call President George W. Bush and offer support. Russia provides intelligence on Afghanistan and doesn't object to U.S. military bases in Central Asia. Putin even inquires about Russia joining NATO. The response from the West is polite but non-committal. Russia is too big, too different, too complicated to integrate into NATO's structure. But the relationship sours quickly. In 2002, the United States withdraws from the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty to pursue missile defense systems in Europe. Russia sees this as destabilizing, an attempt to neutralize Russia's nuclear deterrent. In 2003, the United States invades Iraq without UN approval. To Russians, this confirms that the West follows rules only when convenient, uses force unilaterally when it suits its interests. But the real breaking point comes with the color revolutions. In 2003, Georgia's Rose Revolution overthrows a pro-Russian government. In 2004, Ukraine's Orange Revolution prevents a rigged election from installing a pro-Russian president. The new governments are pro-Western, pro-democracy, and increasingly interested in joining NATO and the European Union. Putin sees these revolutions as Western-sponsored coups, CIA operations designed to encircle Russia with hostile governments. Western governments see them as spontaneous democratic movements, people choosing freedom over authoritarianism. Once again, both sides have fundamentally different interpretations of the same events. In 2004, NATO expands again, adding 7 countries: Bulgaria, Romania, Slovakia, Slovenia, and the 3 Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. The Baltic states are particularly significant. They were part of the Soviet Union. Their membership in NATO means the alliance now shares a border with Russia. From the Baltics' perspective, NATO membership is essential protection against a country that occupied them for 50 years. From Russia's perspective, it's NATO encroaching right up to Russia's borders. At the 2007 Munich Security Conference, Putin delivers a blistering speech. He accuses the United States of creating a unipolar world where one country has overstepped its borders in every way. He criticizes NATO expansion, missile defense, and Western interventionism. It's a watershed moment. Putin is publicly breaking with the West, declaring that Russia will no longer accept a world where it's marginalized. Then comes the 2008 NATO summit in Bucharest. The alliance declares that Ukraine and Georgia will become members of NATO. No timeline is given, but the statement is clear. NATO's door remains open, and these former Soviet republics are next in line. For Putin, this is a red line crossed. Ukraine, particularly, is crucial to Russian identity and security. The idea of Ukraine in NATO is intolerable. In August 2008, war breaks out between Russia and Georgia over the breakaway regions of South Ossetia and Abkhazia. It's a brief, brutal conflict. Russian forces crush the Georgian military in 5 days. The war sends a message. Russia will use military force to maintain its sphere of influence. NATO's response is to condemn Russia but take no military action. The message is received. NATO won't fight Russia for countries that aren't yet members. The 2008 war marks a turning point. The post-Cold War period of relative cooperation is over. Russia and NATO are back in adversarial mode, even if no one calls it a new Cold War yet. Over the next few years, Putin consolidates power at home, cracking down on opposition and independent media. Russia pursues an increasingly assertive foreign policy, pushing back against what it sees as Western encroachment. Then comes 2013 and events in Ukraine that will change everything. Ukraine's president, Viktor Yanukovych, is negotiating an association agreement with the European Union. It's not NATO membership, but it's a major step toward Western integration. Under intense Russian pressure and promised Russian financial aid, Yanukovych suddenly backs out in November 2013. Ukrainians take to the streets in Kyiv. What starts as protests against Yanukovych's decision becomes a broader movement against corruption and authoritarianism. It's called the Euromaidan. For months, protesters occupy Kyiv's Independence Square in freezing weather. The standoff turns violent. In February 2014, security forces fire on protesters. Over 100 people are killed in a single week. On February 21st, Yanukovych signs an agreement with opposition leaders for early elections. But the next day, he flees Ukraine to Russia. A new pro-Western government takes power. To Western observers, the Euromaidan is a democratic revolution. The Ukrainian people, especially young Ukrainians, chose Europe over Russia, freedom over authoritarianism. To Putin, it's a Western-backed coup that overthrew a democratically elected president. It's the color revolutions reaching Ukraine, the West trying to pull Russia's most important neighbor into its orbit. Putin's response is swift and aggressive. In late February 2014, unidentified soldiers in unmarked uniforms, little green men, appear in Crimea, a Ukrainian peninsula with a majority Russian population. They're Russian special forces, though Russia initially denies it. On March 16th, a hastily organized referendum is held in Crimea. Under the watchful eyes of Russian troops, Crimeans vote to join Russia. A few days later, Putin signs documents annexing Crimea. It's the first time since World War II that a European country has forcibly annexed another country's territory. The West reacts with sanctions and condemnation, but no military response. NATO reaffirms its commitment to defend its members, but makes clear that Ukraine, not a member, is on its own. Simultaneously, Russian-backed separatists in eastern Ukraine declare independence for the so-called Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics. War breaks out.
Russia supplies the separatists with weapons, intelligence, and volunteers, actually Russian soldiers. The war in Donbass grinds on, a bloody stalemate. Over 14,000 people die, millions are displaced. Ceasefires are signed and violated repeatedly. The annexation of Crimea and the war in Donbass fundamentally change European security. The post-Cold War assumption that European borders are settled, that territorial conquest is a thing of the past, lies shattered. NATO responds by reinforcing its eastern flank. Troops are deployed to the Baltic states and Poland. Defense spending begins to rise after decades of decline. But there's a problem. NATO still doesn't want to risk direct conflict with Russia. The response is containment, not confrontation. Sanctions, deterrence, but also continued dialogue. For the next 8 years, from 2014 to 2022, this becomes the new normal. A frozen conflict in Ukraine, Russian aggression checked but not reversed. NATO and Russia in a state of heightened tension but not open war. It's an unstable equilibrium, a problem postponed rather than solved.
Between 2014 and 2022, the relationship between NATO and Russia continues to deteriorate. Each side fortifies positions, builds up forces, prepares for potential conflict. Russia conducts increasingly aggressive military exercises near NATO borders. Russian aircraft routinely test NATO airspace, forcing NATO jets to scramble. Russian submarines prowl the North Atlantic. It's reminiscent of Cold War tactics, probing for weaknesses, demonstrating capability, refusing to be ignored. NATO, meanwhile, strengthens collective defense. The enhanced forward presence places multinational battle groups in Poland and the Baltic states, not large enough to repel a Russian invasion alone, but enough to ensure that any attack would immediately involve multiple NATO members, making escalation inevitable. In 2016, NATO holds its largest military exercise since the Cold War, Anaconda 2016, involving 31,000 troops from 24 countries in Poland. The message? NATO is ready to defend its members. But something else is happening during these years: hybrid warfare. Russia is pioneering new forms of aggression that don't involve conventional military force. Cyber attacks, disinformation campaigns, election interference, assassination attempts on foreign soil. Tactics that create chaos and undermine cohesion in Western democracies. In 2016, Russian intelligence interferes in the US presidential election, hacking emails and spreading disinformation. In 2018, Russian agents use a nerve agent to poison a former spy in Salisbury, England. In 2015, a massive cyber attack, attributed to Russia, takes down parts of Ukraine's power grid. These operations are below the threshold of war, but above the threshold of peace. They're designed to divide NATO, to raise doubts about collective defense, to make Western populations question whether confronting Russia is worth the cost. And to some extent, they work. Political divisions in Western countries deepen. Some politicians openly question NATO's value. Others advocate for accommodation with Russia. Putin, meanwhile, has fully embraced the role of adversary to the West. His rhetoric becomes increasingly confrontational. He speaks of Russia's unique civilization, its traditional values opposed to Western decadence. He positions Russia as a defender of conservative values against Western liberalism, appealing to right-wing movements in Europe and America. It's not just geopolitics anymore. It's cultural and ideological. Shades of the Cold War's capitalism versus communism, now reframed as traditional sovereignty versus liberal globalism. Ukraine remains the key flashpoint. Despite the 2014 war, Ukraine continues moving toward the West. The country elects a new president in 2019, Volodymyr Zelensky, a former comedian who campaigns on fighting corruption and eventually joining NATO and the European Union. Putin's position hardens. In a long essay published in July 2021, he argues that Russians and Ukrainians are one people, that Ukrainian independence is a historical accident, that Ukraine's move toward the West is an existential threat to Russia. In late 2021, Russia begins massing troops near Ukraine's border. By February 2022, over 100,000 Russian soldiers are positioned for invasion, along with tanks, artillery, aircraft, and logistics for a major war. The West warns that invasion is imminent. Putin issues demands. NATO must withdraw to its 1997 borders before the post-Cold War expansion. Ukraine must never join NATO. He wants essentially to roll back 30 years of European security architecture. NATO refuses. The principle is clear. Every country has the right to choose its own alliances. Russia doesn't get to veto other countries' sovereign decisions. On February 24, 2022, Russian forces invade Ukraine from multiple directions. It's the largest conventional military operation in Europe since World War II. Missiles strike cities across Ukraine. Russian armor drives toward Kyiv. Putin expects a quick victory, maybe days, at most a few weeks. He expects the Ukrainian government to collapse, for Ukrainian forces to surrender, for the West to protest, but ultimately accept the fait accompli, as it did with Crimea. He's catastrophically wrong. The Ukrainian resistance is fierce and effective. President Zelensky refuses American offers to evacuate, declaring, "I need ammunition, not a ride." Ukrainian forces fight with remarkable courage and competence, ambushing Russian columns, defending cities, inflicting heavy casualties. The Russian military, touted as one of the world's most formidable, proves shockingly unprepared. Logistics fail, communications are compromised, troops lack basic supplies. The much-feared rapid assault on Kyiv stalls in the suburbs. NATO's response, while stopping short of direct military intervention, is more unified and forceful than anyone expected. Massive quantities of weapons flow to Ukraine: anti-tank missiles, artillery, air defense systems, intelligence sharing. Economic sanctions on Russia are severe and comprehensive, targeting banks, industries, and oligarchs. Sweden and Finland, neutral throughout the Cold War, apply to join NATO. Russia's invasion has achieved the opposite of its stated goal. NATO is more united, more purposeful, more relevant than it's been in decades. The war becomes a grinding, brutal conflict. Russia abandons the assault on Kyiv and concentrates on eastern and southern Ukraine. Cities are reduced to rubble. Thousands of soldiers and civilians die. Millions of Ukrainians flee as refugees. NATO walks a tightrope. The alliance provides enormous support to Ukraine, but carefully avoids actions that might trigger direct war with Russia, a nuclear-armed power. No NATO troops fight in Ukraine. No NATO aircraft enforce a no-fly zone. The supplies flow, but always with the understanding that escalation could lead to catastrophe. As of late 2024, the war continues. Russia occupies roughly 18% of Ukrainian territory, but has failed to achieve its original objectives. Ukraine has survived, has retaken some territory, but hasn't been able to fully expel Russian forces. It's a stalemate, but not a frozen conflict. The fighting continues, the death toll mounts, and the underlying issues, Ukraine's future, NATO expansion, European security architecture, remain unresolved. Putin has made clear he views this as an existential struggle, not just for Ukraine, but for Russia's place in the world. NATO, for its part, insists this is about defending the principle that countries cannot change borders by force, that aggression must not be rewarded. We're in a new phase of the NATO-Russia rivalry, perhaps the most dangerous since the Cuban Missile Crisis, because unlike the Cold War, where both sides ultimately respected each other's spheres of influence, this conflict is about fundamentally incompatible visions for the European order.
To understand where we are today, we need to step back and examine how NATO and Russia each see the history we've just explored. The NATO narrative goes something like this. NATO is a defensive alliance of democracies. It has never attacked Russia. Every country that joined NATO did so voluntarily, seeking protection from potential Russian aggression, a fear validated by Russia's invasions of Georgia and Ukraine. NATO expansion wasn't directed against Russia, but was a response to the legitimate security concerns of countries that had suffered under Soviet domination. Russia, in this narrative, is the aggressor. It refused to accept the loss of empire after 1991. It views neighboring countries not as sovereign states, but as its sphere of influence. When those countries chose democracy and Western integration, Russia responded with force. The annexation of Crimea, the invasion of Ukraine, these prove that Russia is a revisionist power seeking to overturn the post-Cold War order. NATO believes it's defending international law and the rights of small nations against a bully. The Russian narrative is very different. In Russia's view, the West exploited Russian weakness in the 1990s. NATO expansion violated the spirit, if not the letter, of assurances given when Germany was reunified. The West promised partnership, but delivered encirclement. Every NATO expansion brought the alliance closer to Russian borders, placing missiles and troops ever nearer. The color revolutions weren't spontaneous democratic movements, but CIA-backed coups designed to install anti-Russian governments. Western intervention in Yugoslavia, Iraq, Libya, all without UN approval, showed that the West uses force unilaterally when it suits its interests. Russia sees itself as defending legitimate security interests against an expansionist, hypocritical West that never accepted Russia as an equal partner. Ukraine isn't about imperial ambition. It's about preventing a hostile military alliance from incorporating a country central to Russian security and identity. Who's right? Both sides have legitimate points, and both ignore inconvenient facts. NATO did expand despite Russian objections, and whether or not explicit promises were made, there's no doubt Russian leaders felt betrayed. NATO did intervene in Kosovo without UN approval, setting a precedent that Russia later exploited. Western support for the color revolutions, while not amounting to coups, did favor outcomes aligned with Western interests. But Russia's narrative also has glaring problems. Countries joined NATO because they feared Russia, not because they were tricked or forced. Russia's invasions of Georgia and Ukraine proved those fears were justified. If Russia wanted good relations with its neighbors, brutality and intimidation were spectacularly counterproductive approaches. The uncomfortable truth is that this conflict emerges from a fundamental incompatibility. NATO believes in a Europe where every country freely chooses its alliances and orientations. Russia believes it has inherent spheres of influence that must be respected. These visions cannot be reconciled without one side capitulating. Throughout this entire history, one factor has shaped every decision, prevented every escalation from going too far: nuclear weapons. Both NATO and Russia possess massive nuclear arsenals. The United States alone has about 5,500 nuclear warheads. Russia has approximately 6,000. France and the United Kingdom, both NATO members, have hundreds more. A nuclear exchange would be civilization ending. We're not talking about military defeat. We're talking about hundreds of millions dead in the initial attacks, followed by a nuclear winter, crop failures, societal collapse, the possible end of human civilization. This is why the current situation is so terrifying. Russia, under pressure in Ukraine, has repeatedly made veiled nuclear threats. Putin has put nuclear forces on high alert. Russian officials have discussed scenarios where nuclear weapons might be used. The message is clear. If Russia faces what it considers an existential threat, nuclear weapons are on the table. NATO takes these threats seriously, but refuses to be intimidated. The response has been to provide Ukraine with advanced conventional weapons, while avoiding actions like sending NATO troops into Ukraine that might trigger nuclear escalation. It's a delicate dance. NATO must support Ukraine enough to prevent Russian victory, but not so much that Russia feels existentially threatened. Too little support, and Ukraine falls. Too much, and we risk nuclear war. Think about that for a moment. Every decision about weapon systems, every debate about sanctions, every choice about troop deployments, all of it takes place in the shadow of nuclear annihilation. Arms control, which helped manage Cold War tensions, has largely collapsed. The Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, abandoned in 2019. The Open Skies Treaty, which allowed surveillance flights to build confidence. Russia withdrew in 2021, the US in 2020. Only one major treaty remains, New START, which limits strategic nuclear weapons. It's set to expire in 2026, and there's no sign of a replacement being negotiated. We're in an arms race again. Russia develops hypersonic missiles that can evade missile defenses. The United States upgrades its nuclear arsenal. NATO increases its conventional forces in Eastern Europe. The mechanisms that prevented miscalculation during the Cold War are degrading. Direct communication between Moscow and Washington is minimal. Military-to-military contacts have been severed. Trust is non-existent. This is how accidents happen, how a misinterpreted radar signal, a miscommunication, a rogue commander could trigger a catastrophe.
The NATO-Russia conflict isn't just about Europe anymore. It's reshaping global politics in profound ways. First, consider China. Beijing watches NATO's response to Ukraine carefully. If NATO appears weak or divided, it might encourage Chinese aggression toward Taiwan. If NATO appears strong and unified, it might deter Chinese action. The Indo-Pacific and European theaters are increasingly linked. China and Russia, meanwhile, have drawn closer. They're not formal allies, both are too proud and self-interested for that, but they coordinate diplomatically and economically. They see themselves as defending a multipolar world order against American hegemony. Second, the conflict is dividing the world into blocs reminiscent of the Cold War. Much of the developing world refuses to pick sides. When the United Nations voted to condemn Russia's invasion of Ukraine, many countries, including India, South Africa, and numerous African and Latin American nations, abstained. They don't want to antagonize either the West or Russia. Many remember Western interventions and see double standards in outrage over Ukraine, while Yemen, Palestine, and other conflicts receive less attention. This frustrates both NATO and Russia, neither of which can claim universal legitimacy. Third, economic warfare has become a major tool. Sanctions on Russia are the most comprehensive ever imposed on a major economy. They've damaged the Russian economy, but they've also created costs for the West: energy prices, food prices, supply chain disruptions. The long-term effect might be a fragmentation of the global economy, with separate Western and non-Western systems, reduced interdependence, and fewer mechanisms for cooperation. Perhaps most concerning, the conflict is reviving ideological dimensions. During the unipolar moment of the 1990s and 2000s, it seemed democracy and markets had won, that ideological struggle was over. That was naive. Putin positions Russia as a defender of traditional values against Western liberalism. He finds allies among right-wing movements in Europe and America who share his hostility to immigration, LGBTQ rights, and secularism. Meanwhile, China promotes its authoritarian capitalist model as an alternative to Western democracy. The world is increasingly divided not just by interests, but by values, by fundamentally different visions of how societies should be organized. We're back in an era of great power competition, where nuclear-armed rivals pursue incompatible visions, and the risk of miscalculation is ever present.
So, where does this go from here? What are the possible futures for the NATO-Russia rivalry? Scenario 1. Prolonged stalemate. The most likely scenario, at least in the near term, is that the current situation continues. The war in Ukraine grinds on without decisive victory for either side. Russia lacks the strength to conquer all of Ukraine. Ukraine lacks the strength to fully expel Russian forces. NATO continues supporting Ukraine with weapons and sanctions while avoiding direct military intervention. Russia endures sanctions and international isolation, but doesn't collapse. The conflict becomes another frozen war, like Korea, technically active but without major changes. This scenario is bleak. Thousands more die. Ukraine remains devastated. European security remains precarious, but it avoids the worst outcome: direct NATO-Russia war. Scenario 2. Russian victory. If Western support for Ukraine wanes, due to political changes, war fatigue, economic costs, Russia might achieve some form of victory. Ukraine could be forced to accept Russian territorial gains and neutrality. This would be catastrophic for European security. It would prove that aggression pays, that borders can be changed by force, that NATO lacks the will to defend the post-Cold War order. Other autocratic powers, particularly China, would be emboldened. NATO would face a credibility crisis. The Baltic states and Poland would question whether NATO would actually defend them if attacked. The alliance could fracture. Scenario 3. Ukrainian victory. Alternatively, sustained Western support could enable Ukraine to reclaim occupied territories and force Russia to withdraw. This would be a strategic defeat for Putin, possibly leading to his downfall. But would a defeated, humiliated Russia accept this outcome? Or would it escalate, potentially even using nuclear weapons? A Russia facing existential defeat is perhaps the most dangerous scenario of all. Even if Russia accepted defeat conventionally, what comes next? Does Russia become democratic? Or does an even more nationalist, revanchist leader take power? History suggests humiliated great powers don't become peaceful, they become vengeful. Scenario 5. Escalation. The nightmare scenario is that the current conflict escalates to direct NATO-Russia war. How might this happen? A missile accidentally hits a NATO country. Russia attacks Western supply lines in Poland. NATO decides to establish a no-fly zone over Ukraine and shoots down Russian aircraft. Chemical or nuclear weapons are used, prompting NATO intervention.
The pathways to escalation are numerous, and once started, escalation might be impossible to control. A conventional NATO-Russia war would be devastating. Millions of casualties, Europe in ruins, and there would always be the risk of nuclear escalation. This is why both sides, despite the rhetoric, have been careful to avoid direct confrontation. NATO doesn't send troops to Ukraine. Russia doesn't attack NATO territory. Both sides maintain channels of communication to prevent accidental war. But accidents happen. Miscalculations occur. In war, control is illusory.
As we near the end of this story, it's worth reflecting on what 75 years of NATO-Russia rivalry teaches us. First lesson: great powers don't easily accept diminished status. Russia in the 1990s was supposed to integrate into the Western order, accept a reduced role, become a normal country. It didn't work. Great powers have histories, identities, and aspirations that don't disappear just because they're temporarily weak. Russian resentment at its post-Soviet treatment was predictable, perhaps inevitable. Second lesson: security dilemmas are real. Actions that seem purely defensive to one side appear aggressive to the other. NATO expansion made countries like Poland feel secure, but made Russia feel threatened. Both perceptions are sincere. The problem isn't that one side is lying, it's that security for one can mean insecurity for another. Breaking these dilemmas requires empathy, communication, and sometimes accepting that your security might require leaving others feeling insecure, which creates a moral and strategic problem. Third lesson: nuclear weapons change everything. Without nuclear weapons, the Cold War might have become hot. NATO and the Warsaw Pact would have clashed directly. Tens of millions might have died in a conventional World War III. Nuclear weapons made that impossible, or rather, too costly to contemplate. But nuclear weapons also create new dangers. They make crises more dangerous. They provide cover for aggression below the nuclear threshold. They require perfect control and zero accidents forever. We've been lucky for 79 years since Hiroshima and Nagasaki. That luck might not hold indefinitely. Fourth lesson: history is narrative. Russians and Westerners have radically different interpretations of the same events. The fall of the Berlin Wall, liberation, or Western expansion? The color revolutions, democratic movements, or CIA coups? NATO expansion, voluntary membership, or encirclement? Both sides construct narratives that cast themselves as victims and the other as aggressor. Both have evidence to support their stories. Neither is entirely wrong, and neither is entirely right. This matters because as long as the historical narratives are incompatible, so are the political positions. You can't negotiate with someone if you fundamentally disagree about what happened and why. Fifth lesson: war is unpredictable. Putin expected to conquer Ukraine in days. NATO expected Ukraine to fall. Russia expected the West to accept the invasion. Ukraine expected more direct NATO support. Everyone was wrong about something. War has its own logic, its own momentum. Once started, it's almost impossible to control. This is why the decision to go to war is so momentous. You're not just choosing to fight, you're surrendering control to chaos.
So here we are, in 2024, 75 years after NATO's founding. The alliance that was supposed to be temporary has outlasted its original enemy and found a new purpose. Or rather, the old purpose has returned. NATO, expanded to 32 members, is more united than it's been in decades, energized by the threat from Russia. Russia, diminished but defiant, positions itself as a defender of national sovereignty against Western imperialism. Between them lies Ukraine, a country fighting for its survival, its European future, its right to exist as an independent state. The immediate questions are tactical. Will Western support for Ukraine continue? Can Ukraine liberate its territory? Will Russia escalate? How will this war end? But the deeper questions are strategic. Is coexistence between NATO and Russia possible? Can we build a European security architecture that provides genuine security for both Russia and its neighbors? Or are we doomed to endless confrontation with periodic crises that risk nuclear war? History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. We're not in a new Cold War exactly. The ideological element is weaker. The economic integration between Russia and the West, while now severed, was deeper than during the Cold War. The alliances are different. But the fundamental dynamics are familiar. Two sides with incompatible visions, mutual mistrust, military buildups, proxy conflicts, nuclear dangers. The Cold War ended peacefully, against many expectations. Perhaps this confrontation will too. Perhaps some future leader, on one side or both, will find a way to break the cycle, to build trust, to create a new framework for coexistence. Or perhaps not. Perhaps we're entering a new era of great power conflict that will define the 21st century the way the Cold War defined the 20th. Perhaps future historians, if there are future historians, will look back on our era as the moment when humanity failed to learn from history, failed to step back from the brink. The story of NATO versus Russia isn't finished. We're living through a crucial chapter right now. The decisions made in Washington, Brussels, Moscow, and Kiev in the coming months and years will shape that story's ending. Will it be tragedy or survival? Catastrophe or coexistence? War or peace? That depends on choices not yet made, on wisdom that may or may not emerge, on luck that may or may not hold. The entire history of NATO versus Russia is a story of how close we've come to the unthinkable and how we've managed so far to step back each time. The question now is whether we can keep doing that, keep avoiding the catastrophe that has always been possible, keep finding ways to compete without destroying ourselves. That's the story of our time. And unlike history, its ending hasn't been written yet. Thank you for watching this exploration of the entire history of NATO versus Russia. This documentary represents one interpretation of 75 years of complex history. As with all history, perspectives differ, and reasonable people disagree about causes, motivations, and responsibilities. What's certain is that the NATO-Russia relationship will continue to shape global security for the foreseeable future. Understanding this history, its patterns, its lessons, its unresolved tensions, is essential for understanding our world and our future. Stay informed, stay engaged, and remember that the decisions of leaders are shaped by the awareness and will of citizens. The future isn't predetermined. It's up to all of us.